There are places where respect is measured by the price of the menu, and people become invisible for wearing the wrong clothes. Monaco was one of those places, a restaurant dressed in elegance, all marble floors and chandeliers that hung like crystal jewelry, casting warm halos of light onto tables lined with silverware so specific they had names. The ceilings were high enough to make your voice echo, and the silence carried more weight than conversation. It was the kind of place where diners didn't just expect service, they expected reverence, and in the middle of that grand illusion was Emilio. He was a quiet presence, not the fastest server, not the most charming, but there was something in the way he moved, graceful, precise, almost ritualistic. He listened like someone who chose to be present, not someone forced by circumstance. He never spoke of his life outside the restaurant. He arrived early, wore a spotless uniform, and performed each task with the calm of a man who carried no resentment, only intention. The others respected him, though they barely knew him. That night, Monaco welcomed a family known to the staff by reputation alone, the Del Rincons. Their reservation was marked as Priority A, which meant center table, direct line of sight from the front entrance, and immediate alert to the kitchen. 3 generations stepped into the restaurant's warm light. The grandfather wore a dark-tailored suit and walked slowly but deliberately. Arturo, his son, moved faster, one hand on his phone, the other adjusting a Bluetooth earpiece as if always mid-negotiation. Valeria, Arturo's wife, followed in high heels that clicked with purpose, her eyes sweeping the room with practiced detachment. Their teenage son Nico trailed behind in a branded hoodie and the kind of scowl reserved for anything that resembled work or respect. They were seated exactly where the world could see them, the center table, positioned like a stage. Emilio was assigned to serve them. He approached with calm, menu in hand, but Arturo didn't lift his gaze from his phone. "Bring us something decent," he said flatly, "and fast. We don't have time or patience tonight." Emilio nodded. Silently. He didn't flinch, didn't correct him, just took the order with the same grace as always. As he turned away, Nico raised his phone and snapped a photo of Emilio's back. "Look at this guy," he muttered to his mother. "He looks like he walked out of one of those movies about poor people. He even has that sad waiter face." Valeria didn't even blink. "Don't pay attention, sweetie," she said. "People like him aren't here to be noticed. They're here to serve, not to be important." The words floated out like smoke, light and poisonous. Emilio kept moving. One dish after another, he delivered their meal with the precision of a trained performer. Each plate a silent act of dignity, but the comments didn't stop. "You know what bothers me about this place?" Arturo said, cutting into his steak. "They'll hire anyone these days. Before, waiters used to know their place. Now they walk around like they think they're part of the restaurant." Valeria agreed. "They've got protagonist syndrome, like their lives are interesting to us." Emilio returned just in time to pour the wine. Arturo leaned slightly toward Valeria and whispered, not softly enough, "Look at this one. You can tell he has no clue what this bottle costs. I bet he's never had anything that didn't come out of a box." Still, Emilio didn't react. His hands were steady, his expression unchanged. He poured the wine as if each drop required his full attention, but inside the words did not evaporate. They lingered. They echoed in a place that remembered every slight, every lowered gaze, every time someone had mistaken his silence for smallness. And yet he stayed silent. The restaurant around them buzzed faintly with the soft hum of conversations and the occasional clink of glass. Outside, the city glowed with the kind of indifference that mirrored the dining room. Inside, Emilio continued to serve, never rushing, never faltering. The dessert arrived, a delicate tower of meringue and fruit, perfectly plated. As Emilio set it down in front of Nico, the teenager smirked, leaned slightly back, and let his spoon drop onto the floor. "Pick it up," he said, not looking at Emilio. There was no sarcasm, just command. Emilio looked at the spoon, resting on the marble like a symbol, a test. He didn't move. For a second, he simply stood there, eyes fixed on the polished metal. The moment stretched. The dining room felt it. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. "Did you not hear me?" Nico asked, louder this time, his voice edged with irritation. Arturo looked up, frowning. "Is there a problem, young man?" Emilio slowly bent down, picked up the spoon, and placed it gently onto a clean napkin. His voice was soft but clear. "Anything else I can help you with?" The words were simple, the tone was not. There was something in his voice, measured, direct, that made Arturo pause. It wasn't defiance, but it wasn't submission either. It was something else. A quiet assertion. The kind that didn't ask permission to exist. Arturo blinked, unsure how to respond. "Bring the bill," he said finally, a forced calm in his voice. "And tell the manager to come. I want to file a complaint. This waiter has an attitude problem." Emilio nodded. "Of course, sir, the manager will be with you shortly." He turned and walked away. Same calm steps, same dignified posture. But he didn't go to the manager. He went to the back, through the kitchen, past the cooks who looked at him with silent recognition, past the dishwasher who greeted him with a nod, down a short hallway to a small office. Inside, he removed his apron, folded it carefully, and placed it on the chair. He opened a drawer, pulled out a leather folder, and flipped it open. Inside was a document. At the top, Monarca Restaurant, solely proprietor Emilio Morales. He closed the folder slowly, then stood, took a breath, looked at himself in the mirror on the wall. He adjusted the collar of his plain white shirt and slipped on a light grey jacket. Nothing about his appearance screamed wealth, but there was something in his eyes now. A shift, not a man about to punish, a man ready to remind. The walk from the office to the dining room felt different this time. Emilio's shoes tapped softly against the tile, a quiet rhythm that didn't ask for attention but commanded presence. No uniform, no tray, just a man in a light jacket moving with quiet authority. The dining room was still mid-conversation when he emerged. The Del Rincons were laughing at something Valeria had said. Arturo was already checking his phone again, disengaged, as if nothing of note had happened. Nico sat scrolling, detached, and smug. They didn't see Emilio at first. Or maybe they did, but didn't recognize him. He stopped beside their table, the same one where he had just been ordered to pick something off the floor. "Good evening," he said, voice level, tone unchanged. "I'm Emilio Morales, owner of Monarca." Arturo looked up, his brow furrowed, a glitch in his natural superiority. "Sorry, what did you say?" Emilio repeated it, calm, clear. "I'm the owner. I founded this restaurant 5 years ago." There was a moment of collective stillness. Valeria tilted her head slightly, searching for irony or some misplaced joke from a particularly bold manager. "Is this part of some experience?" she asked. "Like immersive dining?" "No," Emilio said simply. "This is just a restaurant, and I am its owner." Arturo's mouth twitched, unsure whether to smile, argue, or recover his position. "Well," he muttered, shifting in his seat, "I suppose that explains the attitude." "It wasn't attitude," Emilio replied. "It was restraint. That landed harder than he intended, but softer than he felt. For a moment he considered walking away, letting the truth linger like perfume over their half-finished plates. But something in Arturo's narrowed eyes told him that if he left it there, they'd forget. They'd move on, and worse, they'd learn nothing. So he stayed. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a thick envelope on the table. "Here's your bill," he said, "and a note, a personal one." Arturo picked it up slowly, then opened the envelope. Inside, written in neat, deliberate handwriting, were the words, "When you have power, observe how you treat those who don't. That's where your true value is revealed." Arturo stared at it. His lips moved slightly as he reread the sentence, but no sound came out. For the first time that evening, he looked still. The silence around their table began to stretch outward. Nearby guests had taken notice. A few eyes turned from their wineglasses and conversation. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting. Just a quiet exchange with an unexpected weight. Valeria finally broke the silence. "I think, perhaps, there was a misunderstanding." "There wasn't," Emilio said gently. "I understood perfectly." She straightened her back, crossed one leg over the other. You know, I come from a family that built everything from the ground up. My grandfather used to—" "You don't need to explain," Emilio interrupted, still composed. "I'm not here to shame you. I just wanted to serve your table like I do every other, with respect, and to remind you that being served does not make you superior. Just fortunate." There it was again, measured but unshakable, not a sermon, not an accusation, a reminder. Nico, who had remained unusually quiet, suddenly looked up. His face had changed. The sarcastic smirk was gone. In its place was something uncertain, maybe guilt, maybe confusion. He looked at his parents, then back at Emilio. "I didn't know you were the owner," he said. Emilio's gaze didn't falter. "Would it have changed the way you treated me?" Nico didn't respond. He looked away instead. That was enough. Without another word, Emilio offered a respectful nod and turned to walk back through the restaurant. But now, as he passed between the tables, something was different. The other guests who had witnessed the moment, who had picked up on the shift in atmosphere, nodded at him. A few offered faint smiles. One or two even clapped quietly, a restrained kind of applause born not of spectacle but recognition. Emilio didn't return to the kitchen. He exited through the front door and stood outside, letting the night air cool the back of his neck. The street buzzed gently, taxis and headlights slicing through the dark. He looked out, not as the man who had just owned the room, but as the one who remembered what it meant to be overlooked inside it. Because once, not so long ago, he had been invisible too. He'd worn uniforms that didn't quite fit. He'd worked 12-hour shifts in the back of a cheap diner, scrubbing pans while cooks shouted orders over his head. He'd stayed silent while being spoken to like furniture, and not out of weakness, but because he had a goal. Every coin saved, every night class taken, every recipe practiced alone after closing, was a brick in the quiet foundation of something greater. That foundation had become Monarca. But foundations are often buried, unseen, like the people who build them. Inside, the Del Rincon sat quietly. Arturo folded the note and placed it in his breast pocket without a word. Valeria stirred her drink. Nico tapped his fingers nervously against the table. None of them touched the dessert. Back in the kitchen, the staff buzzed with quiet energy. They had seen Emilio return without his apron. They had watched the interaction, and though none had heard the full exchange, they felt the shift. Respect doesn't need volume to be understood. The sous chef, a woman named Rosa, leaned over to a younger dishwasher. "He did it again," she said under her breath. "Handled it like a gentleman." "Like a boss," the dishwasher replied with a grin. And in the dining room, as the guests settled back into their meals, a new kind of conversation took hold, not about wine or business deals, but about what they had just seen, about how power, when worn quietly, becomes something stronger than dominance. It becomes grace. Later that night, when the last table was cleared and the lights dimmed, Emilio sat alone by the window, sipping coffee from a plain ceramic mug. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just sat quietly, watching the reflection of the empty room in the glass. The center table was now cleared, wiped, reset, just like everything else. The following morning, the restaurant looked the same, but something had shifted. The staff whispered, more than usual, not with gossip but with reverence. News of what had happened spread in fragments. No one knew every word that had been said, but the essence of it traveled faster than truth ever could. Emilio Morales, the man who had polished glasses beside them, who had cleaned spills and served with quiet grace, had faced the entitled Del Rincon family with nothing but composure and presence, and revealed himself to be the man behind it all. By evening, the tension from the night before had softened into a calm reverence. Still, Emilio carried himself no differently. He returned to his post, dressed in his uniform, sleeves buttoned, collar pressed. He refused the pedestal. His staff offered to take over his tables, to give him a night of rest, but he declined with a simple wave. "Let's just serve," he said, but as he moved through the evening's rhythm, his mind drifted backward, not just to the night before, but to the moment everything had clicked. The spoon dropped, On purpose, the command that followed, and his choice not to react with pride or rage or vengeance, but something harder: restraint. That moment was still alive in him, fragile and burning. He hadn't always known how to control himself. Years ago, a younger version of Emilio might have responded differently. Back then, working in a cramped kitchen for minimum wage, he remembered a manager snapping his fingers at him like a dog, telling him to move faster or move out. Emilio had gritted his teeth, but he'd moved, and every time he was spoken to as less than human, he told himself, not yet. You don't respond. Not yet. Because this is fuel. Every slight, every insult. It's wood for the fire you'll light later. And now the fire was lit. But Emilio didn't want to burn anyone with it. He wanted to warm something better, something that lasted longer than revenge. That's why when the spoon hit the floor, he didn't hesitate out of confusion. He hesitated out of choice. He had seen the gleam in Nico's eyes, the need to assert power, the assumption that the man before him was nothing more than a vessel for tasks. It wasn't new. Emilio had seen that same look in dozens of faces before, always attached to people who had confused money with character. He remembered lowering himself slowly, watching the reflection of the spoon in the marble. Seeing, not his own face, but the echo of everyone who had ever been made small in a room like that. When he finally picked it up and laid it gently on the napkin, the sound of it landing was softer than a breath, but heavier than any insult spoken that night, and then he'd spoken. Anything else I can help you with? A question, yes, but also a statement. A boundary, quiet but firm. That sentence had startled Arturo more than a shouted reply ever would have. Back in the present, Emilio moved toward table 4, refilled a glass of wine, then nodded to the chef as a new course went out. Each step was intentional, each word offered with care. He didn't need to explain his story to every guest. He didn't need anyone to know. That's what made it powerful. Still, memory clung. He could still feel the weight of Arturo's stare when he opened the handwritten note. Not the kind of stare that demanded an apology, but the kind that realized for a single humbling moment that it had missed something, that it had judged wrong. And beneath all that posturing, maybe there had been fear. Because there's nothing more threatening to those who cling to status than being outclassed by someone they tried to diminish. Emilio hadn't written that note for revenge. He'd written it because he believed it. When you have power, observe how you treat those who don't. That's your real character. He remembered writing those words late one night, weeks ago, long before the Del Rincons had even reserved a table. He had dozens of copies of that note, kept in a drawer in his office just in case. He'd never handed one out until then, and now Arturo had one in the pocket of his expensive jacket, folded and heavy as stone. The evening wore on. Guests arrived, dined and left. A couple on their anniversary toasted each other with soft eyes. A group of young professionals laughed too loud in the back. The normalcy was comforting, but for Emilio, the spoon still lay in the back of his mind. Not because of what it represented, but because of what came after. The shift, the way the guests at surrounding tables had started to look at him differently, the subtle clapping, the nods, respect that hadn't been there before. He didn't resent it, but he did question it. Why now? Why only once they knew? Did dignity only matter once it had a price tag? That, perhaps, was the harder truth. That many people only recognize worth when it's wrapped in title, ownership, or wealth. Until then, it's invisible. Invisible like he had once been, scrubbing plates in a kitchen that didn't even offer staff meals. Invisible like the janitor he had trained with, who could barely speak Spanish but always worked with honor. Invisible like the girl who refilled the water glasses now at Monarca, someone he made sure was treated with dignity every shift. Invisibility wasn't silence. It was misrecognition. The failure to see someone's full humanity simply because they were serving you. That's what made the spoon on the floor such a moment. It wasn't about the spoon. It was about the message it was meant to send. Know your place. And Emilio had responded not with words, not with indignation, but with something rarer. No, no mine. He didn't need to say it aloud. He showed it in how he picked up the spoon, in how he laid it down like something sacred, in how he stood afterward, just a few inches taller. And that was what they remembered. That night, after the last guest had left and the last dish had been cleaned, Emilio walked through the now empty dining room. He paused at the center table, fingers lightly tracing the edge. No spotlight, no audience, just memory. He looked down. There, in the same spot where the spoon had fallen, a soft polish mark remained, just barely visible in the reflection of the overhead lights. He bent down, not to pick anything up this time, but to wipe it once more. Carefully, thoughtfully. Then he straightened, turned off the light, and left the table behind. Before Monaco had marble floors and chandeliers, it was just an idea. A stubborn thought Emilio carried with him through kitchens that smelled more like sweat than spices, over cracked linoleum floors and broken walk-in freezers. The kind of kitchens where the staff clocked in early and left late, invisible to the dining room. There were no sommeliers, no linen napkins, only heat, steam, and noise. And through all of it, Emilio worked, quietly, tirelessly. He had started as a dishwasher, not in some romantic storybook way, but because it was the only job available to someone with no experience, no connections, and an accent that betrayed his origin before he said a word. It was work no one else wanted, hot, wet, endless. But Emilio took it with gratitude. Every night when the last plate had been stacked, he stayed behind. Not because he was asked to, but because the kitchen emptied out and gave him space to breathe. In those hours, he taught himself. He studied the chefs, watched how they prepped sauces, timed reductions, built flavors. He asked questions when they let him. When they didn't, he watched anyway. He practiced at home using scraps he took with permission, a bruised onion, a day-old baguette. He experimented until he understood balance. He read cookbooks from the library like they were sacred texts, dog-earing every page with a technique he didn't know. And still, during service, he washed dishes, still invisible. He didn't complain. He observed. Years passed. He moved up slowly, line cook, prep cook, eventually sous chef. Always in someone else's kitchen, always behind someone else's name. He learned discipline, precision, how to lead a team, how not to lose your head when an order came back wrong and the dining room was full. He saved every tip, every extra shift. He lived in a modest apartment with paper-thin walls and dreams far too large for the space. Monaco was born on a sleepless night when he took out a notepad and drew a floor plan that didn't exist yet. A place with open kitchens and wide windows. A place where no one working in the back would feel like they were in exile. Where elegance didn't mean arrogance. He didn't know how or when, but he decided it would exist. The years that followed tested that belief. He applied for small loans and was denied. He worked 3 jobs at once, burned through 2 pairs of shoes in a single year and still came up short. Friends told him it was impossible. A few offered him money in exchange for control, but he refused. He wanted to build it without owing anyone. No compromises, no dilution of the idea. Then one day he found it. A small abandoned storefront on a quiet street. It had once been a bakery, the signage still ghosted on the bricks. The windows were cracked, the ceiling leaked, but when he stepped inside, he saw it. Not what it was, but what it could be. He poured every cent he had into the place, did most of the renovation himself, often working through the night. Painted the walls, laid the first tiles by hand, repaired the plumbing with help from a retired neighbor who knew a thing or two about pipes. When he ran out of money, he worked double shifts until he had enough to keep going. He opened Monaco with 1 table. Just one, a test table, no advertising, no big launch, just a single reservation each night. Emilio cooked, served, cleaned, everything. Word spread slowly but genuinely. People didn't just talk about the food. They talked about how it made them feel, seen. Over time, the restaurant grew. 2 tables, then 4, then 10. He hired his first employee, a shy waitress with a gentle voice who had once been rejected from another fine dining place for not looking the part. Emilio didn't care about that. He trained her himself. Years passed. The chandeliers were added. The marble came later. So did the 3 branches, the waiting list, the attention. The guests who came not just for the menu, but for the experience of being treated like the only table in the room. And yet, Emilio still served. Not every night, but often enough that regulars thought of him as just another part of the staff. He liked it that way. He liked knowing how his restaurant truly felt, not from surveys, not from reports, but from the silence between a guest's bite and their smile. He never corrected anyone who assumed he was just a server. Never boasted. He didn't need to. But moments like the one with the Del Rincons reminded him why he'd built Monarca in the first place. Not just to cook food, not just to run a business, but to create a space where dignity wasn't tied to role or appearance. He thought back to that moment, their confusion when he introduced himself, their disbelief. It wasn't surprising. He had seen that reaction before, people struggling to reconcile humility with authority, as if the two couldn't coexist. That was the illusion Monarca tried to shatter. Later that night, Emilio returned to the small office in the back. He kept it humble. Just a desk, a filing cabinet, a few photos tacked to the wall. One was of the storefront on the day he found it. Another of the first reservation, an older couple celebrating their anniversary. A third was of his parents, taken decades ago before they had moved to the city. He sat down, opened the drawer, and looked at the folder with the ownership papers. Not because he needed to prove anything to himself, but because sometimes it helped to remember, not what he had built, but how. He pulled out another envelope, blank and identical to the one he had given Arturo, slipped another handwritten note. Inside, the same words penned again with quiet steadiness. He didn't know who would receive the next one, only that they would, because power reveals people. And sometimes the smallest gesture, like picking up a spoon without anger, tells the truest story. He sealed the envelope, placed it back in the drawer, and turned off the desk lamp. In the hallway, the soft hum of the walk-in fridge buzzed behind the kitchen wall. From the front of the restaurant, laughter floated faintly. Real, relaxed, untouched by what had happened days before. And somewhere, perhaps, someone like Arturo del Rincon sat in a high-rise apartment, reading and rereading that same handwritten note, unsure of whether it was meant to hurt or to heal. The answer was both, but gently. Weeks passed. The story of the man who owned a restaurant and served unnoticed at his own tables had already begun to circulate beyond the walls of Monarca. It hadn't come from Emilio. It never would have. But one of the guests, someone who had witnessed the scene from a nearby table, had written about it online. A short post, just a few hundred words, no names, no photos, just a simple recollection of a quiet confrontation, a spoon, and a note that had stunned a wealthy man into silence. The post went viral. Not in a sensational way, but in the kind of way people shared when they were moved. When something struck a nerve they didn't know they had. Strangers reposted it with captions like, "This is how power should look," and "I needed this today." The restaurant's reservation list doubled, then tripled. Not everyone came for the food anymore. Some came for the story, for the chance to be served by the owner without knowing it. Emilio didn't change. He continued to work the floor when he wanted to, dressed in uniform, polite, watchful. The staff respected his rhythm. The guests, even when suspecting who he was, never got confirmation unless they needed it. Then, one evening, Arturo del Rincon returned, not with his wife, not with his son, just him, alone. He stood at the entrance wearing a dark shirt, open collar, no jacket, no Bluetooth in his ear. In his hand, loosely gripped, was his tie. It wasn't being worn. It hung from his fingers like an offering. Bessie. Hostess recognized him immediately. She didn't ask if he had a reservation. He didn't. She didn't ask what he wanted. She simply said, "One moment," and walked quietly to the back to find Emilio. Emilio had just finished checking in, with the kitchen reviewing the orders with Rosa when she approached. "He's here," she said softly. "The man from that night, alone." Emilio paused, not surprised, but still undecided. He thought for a moment. then nodded. He walked out to the front. Arturo looked up as he approached and stood a little straighter, as if unsure of what to expect. "Came to speak with you," Arturo said, his voice low, more grounded than before. "If that's all right?" Emilio didn't smile. He didn't make it easier. "You came back." "I did." "Why?" Arturo looked down at the tie in his hand, then placed it carefully on the small table beside the host stand. "I don't have an excuse," he said. "Only a realization. That night I saw myself and I didn't like what I saw." Emilio didn't respond. "I've been to restaurants all over the world," Arturo continued. "Michelin stars, private clubs, places where everything is designed to make you feel superior. But not once in all those places did I ever feel what I felt here. Embarrassed, yes, but also exposed." Still, Emilio said nothing. Silence had always been his sharpest tool. "I wanted to apologize. Not just to you, to anyone I've ever treated like furniture." Emilio finally spoke. "An apology is only useful if it leads to change." Arturo nodded. "That's why I came. I thought maybe we could talk, like people, not as customer and owner." Emilio looked him in the eye for a moment, then stepped aside and gestured toward the dining room. "Follow me." He didn't lead Arturo to the center table. He chose a corner one, quieter, less visible. The two men sat. No menus, no wine list. Emilio waved to the kitchen without a word. He already knew what would be served. For a while they said nothing. The first course arrived, a simple dish, rustic, comforting. Grilled vegetables over handmade bread, lightly brushed with oil and herbs. They ate slowly. Eventually Arturo spoke again. "You know my son, Nico, he asked about you the next day. Said you looked like you weren't scared of us, that you didn't care who we were." Emilio looked up. "And what did you tell him?" "I said I didn't think you were scared of anything, but that I wasn't sure if that was a strength or if I just didn't understand it yet." "It's not about fear," Emilio said. "It's about choice." "And humility?" "No," Emilio replied. "Humility can be performative. It's about clarity, knowing who you are, regardless of how others see you." Arturo considered that. "He's a good kid," he said eventually. "Under all the noise, I think he just copies me more than I thought." "That's how it works," Emilio said. "Children don't inherit values. They inherit behavior." Another pause. The second course arrived. Slow-cooked meat with saffron rice, a dish Emilio had made many times in his early days, born from scarcity and turned into something rich. Arturo took a bite and closed his eager eyes briefly. "You built all this from nothing?" "No," Emilio said. "I built it from things most people overlook: time, repetition, intent." Arturo nodded slowly. After the meal, neither of them asked for dessert. They sat with 2 small cups of coffee instead. The room around them buzzed gently, but they were outside it now. 2 men having a conversation that had taken years to become possible. Arturo leaned back, looking around the restaurant for the first time, not as a customer, but as a student. "You know what I realized," he said. "All my life I've measured success in noise, volume, deals, profiles, but this place, it's the quiet that speaks loudest." Emilio didn't answer. He didn't need to. When the bill came, it was already paid. Emilio had arranged it with the kitchen before Arturo ever walked in. Arturo reached for his wallet anyway. "At least let me tip." "There's nothing to tip," Emilio interrupted gently. Tonight wasn't service. It was conversation. Arturo stood. He looked at the tie he had placed at the entrance, left it there. "Thank you," he said. Emilio extended his hand. Arturo shook it, firmly but without performance. They didn't say goodbye, they didn't need to. As Arturo walked out into the night past guests who didn't recognize him or care who he was, Emilio returned to the dining room, adjusting a place setting that had been nudged slightly off-center. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Details always do, especially when the loudest lessons are the quietest ones. Long after Arturo left, after the kitchen had dimmed its lights and the last staff member had finished closing duties, Emilio remained, seated in the corner booth, the same one where they had spoken. His eyes traced the empty coffee cups, the untouched napkin, the space on the table where the tie had not been. There was no lingering bitterness, no triumphant glow, only a stillness. The kind that settles after something hard has finally softened. That night stayed with him, not because it had redeemed Arturo, but because it had confirmed something Emilio had always believed, even when no one else did. That respect, when planted in silence, could still grow into something meaningful. He rose, adjusted the chairs, slightly so. They were perfectly aligned, and turned off the last of the dining room lights. In his small office behind the kitchen, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a photo. Not the storefront this time, but one older, slightly wrinkled at the corners. It showed a boy no older than 13 standing beside his father outside a hardware store. His father held a bag of cement over his shoulder, smiling in that worn-out way working men do when they're proud but tired. Emilio stared at the photo for a while, then set it down beside a stack of old recipes. That image, more than any document or review, was the true blueprint for Monarca. His father had believed in work, not just the labor itself, but the dignity that came from doing it right. He had taught Emilio how to lay brick, not because he expected him to build houses, but because he believed that even if you built dreams, you needed to know how to support their weight. And Monarca, as elegant as it was, had been built from that same ethic. Back in the early days, when the restaurant was still just a floor plan sketched onto napkins and hope, Emilio had worked in kitchens that were barely held together. Places where the tiles peeled up under your shoes and the ceiling dripped when it rained. He'd learned to cook not in culinary schools but in chaos, amid shouting chefs, rusted stoves and missing inventory. But every night after the chaos ended and the doors closed, he had stayed behind. Not out of duty, but desire. He cleaned the station slowly, wiped every surface, and then cooked something small for himself. Just one plate. Something that taught him one new thing: how to coax sweetness out of onions, how to sharpen acid with salt, how to let the heat do the work instead of forcing flavor too soon. Each night, he added something to his knowledge. He wasn't just learning technique, he was learning patience. He remembered one night years ago when a new chef had mocked his insistence on plating even his own meals beautifully. "No one's going to see that," the man had laughed. "Why bother?" Emilio had answered simply, "Because I see it." That was the core of it all. Respect wasn't just about how you treated others. It was about how you treated your work, even when no one was watching. Maybe especially then. Monarca's success wasn't an accident. It wasn't marketing or buzz. It was detail layered over detail. Emilio had chosen the fabric for the napkins, the curvature of the chairs, the exact amount of overhead light per table, but he'd also chosen who would be in the kitchen, not just for skill but for the way they moved, their posture, their respect for heat, for time, for each other. He made it a rule early on: no yelling in the kitchen. If someone made a mistake, they'd fix it, but they'd fix it with clarity, not volume. That had been the hardest rule to enforce at first. So many chefs had come from places where screaming was a language, but Emilio had learned early on that panic spreads faster than calm. And he wanted his kitchen to breathe, not suffocate. Rosa, now his head sous chef, had once told him it was the first time she'd worked in a kitchen where she didn't flinch when someone walked behind her. That mattered more than a Michelin star ever could. Emilio kept a list in his desk drawer, not of suppliers or schedules, but of people. Everyone who had ever worked in his restaurant, even if only for a week. Beside each name, he wrote one thing they taught him: a habit, a truth, a reminder, because respect wasn't one-sided. One of the most important things he'd learned came from a dishwasher named Matteo. Young, quiet, with little formal education, but an uncanny instinct for rhythm. Emilio had noticed he moved differently, quick, efficient, but never rushed. When asked why, Matteo had replied, "If the plates arrive clean but broken, no one can use them. The job is cleaning, but the purpose is preserving." That line stayed with him. The job is cleaning, but the purpose is preserving. That was Monarca. That was his whole philosophy. He wasn't just serving food. He was preserving dignity. In every plate, in every step, in every interaction, whether someone saw it or not. And so, when guests asked how the restaurant achieved its reputation for feeling different, Emilio never offered a clever line. He just said, We listen to the room. That meant the clink of silverware, the tempo of conversations, the silence between courses. When someone snapped their fingers to call a server, Emilio noticed. When a guest asked a waiter's name instead, of just pointing, he noticed that too. The dining room wasn't just where meals happened. It was where values were tested, and every night Monica passed or failed depending on who walked through the door. That's why Arturo's return had meant something. Not because he came back different, but because he came back willing. To listen, to sit, to speak like a man instead of a client. It didn't change the past, but it gave it context. Some people needed to be humbled. Others just needed space to realize they already had been. The staff never asked what was said that night. They didn't need to. The energy in the room had shifted. They could feel it. Later that week, Emilio pulled Rosa aside and handed her the shift schedule. She scanned it, then looked up. "You're off Thursday night? I have something I want to cook. For a guest?" "For myself." She nodded. No questions. That Thursday, after the last reservation, Emilio returned to the kitchen alone. He didn't turn on all the lights, just one above the prep counter. He pulled out ingredients he hadn't touched in months, not fancy ones. Just the ones that taught him how to build. Garlic, butter, rice, one tomato, a piece of fish. He cooked slowly, not for perfection, for memory. And when it was done, he plated it with care. Sat in the last booth by the window. Ate every bite in. Silence, because respect, like food, is best served when you don't rush it. It was a quiet evening, the kind Monaca reserved for slower footfalls and longer dinners. Rain tapped softly on the windows, casting ripples of sound across the dining room like an ambient score. The lights were slightly dimmer than usual, not out of oversight, but because Emilio had always believed that mood came not just from flavor, but from light, from sound, from timing. He stood near the entrance, adjusting a set of new menus when the door opened and Arturo stepped inside again. This time he wasn't dressed down. He wasn't dressed up either. He wore a clean white shirt, sleeves rolled, no jacket, no tie. Just him, standing without pretense, holding nothing in his hands. He looked around the restaurant for a moment and spotted Emilio instantly. They didn't exchange greetings right away. Arturo approached slowly, then stopped a step short of the host stand. "I called," Arturo said. "Didn't leave a name. Just hoped you'd let me in again." Emilio nodded once, then gestured toward the same corner table where they had spoken last time. No reservations had been booked there that evening. Emilio had made sure of it. Arturo sat. This time, he didn't wait to be asked. "I've been thinking a lot," he said. "Not just about that night, about all the nights before it, about the way I've spoken to people, the things I've said without even realizing it." Emilio remained standing. He listened, not with skepticism, but with patience. Arturo didn't seem to mind. "I've had success," Arturo continued. "A lot of it. Built a company, raised a family, paid for the right schools, did everything that was expected of a man in my position. But I think I confused the noise I was making for meaning." Still, Emilio said nothing. He knew when words needed space. Arturo leaned back slightly, as if exhaling something he'd carried too long. "After I left here, I couldn't stop thinking about that moment with my son. The spoon. The way he gave that order, like it was nothing. Like it was how things were supposed to be. And I realized he was copying me. My posture, my tone, my disregard." Emilio finally sat across from him. "And?" Emilio asked, his voice steady. Arturo replied, "And it scared me. Because if he becomes me, without learning what I've just started to learn, he won't be better, he'll just be louder." There was silence between them again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It had air in it, room to breathe. Arturo reached into his pocket and placed a small folded piece of paper on the table. "I kept your note," he said. "I read it more times than I'll admit." Emilio didn't reach for it. He only glanced at it, then met Arturo's gaze. "And what did it teach you?" Emilio asked. Arturo looked down, then back up. "That I don't want to be a man who needs to be reminded how to treat others. I want to be someone who already knows." Emilio studied his face, not just the words, but the weight behind them. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. The meal began without menus, without orders. Emilio had planned it in advance, not with extravagance, but with intention. The first dish was the same one he had made for himself during his early nights at Monarca, a plate that began in scarcity and had become, through repetition and refinement, something elegant. It was not served to impress. It was served to share. As Arturo took the first bite, he looked at Emilio across the table. "I never asked," Arturo said, "why you stayed quiet that night, why you didn't respond to everything we said." Emilio didn't hesitate. "Because that wasn't the time to speak," he said. "Words spoken in anger are often just echoes. I wanted mine to be a mirror." Arturo nodded slowly, chewing in silence. Later, over the second course, a grilled fish marinated in citrus and finished. With a subtle glaze, Arturo shifted the conversation. "My father taught me how to close deals, how to manage risk, how to grow an empire. But he never taught me how to sit quietly with someone and just listen." Emilio replied, "Maybe he didn't know how." "Maybe not," Arturo agreed, "but I want my son to learn, and that means I have to learn first." That, Emilio, anew was the start of change, not the desire to transform others, but the willingness to start with oneself. They spoke for a while longer, about family, about childhood, about moments missed, and ones that still had time to be claimed. The food became secondary, a quiet backdrop to a conversation that neither of them had been capable of having weeks ago. At one point, Arturo asked if he could help in some way. Offer an investment, a donation, something to show his gratitude. Emilio shook his head. "If you want to honor what happened here," he said, "go home and serve someone without needing to be thanked. Speak to someone beneath you like they were beside you. Do that, and this conversation meant something." Arturo didn't press. He only nodded, then reached for the note again. He unfolded it carefully, reread the line once more. "When you have power, observe how you treat those who don't. That's where your true value is revealed." This time, he understood every word of it. When the dinner ended, there was no applause. No photo, no handshake for the sake of optics. There was just a quiet goodbye, and the understanding that this wasn't closure. It was a continuation. As Arturo stood to leave, he paused at the edge of the dining room and looked back. Not to say anything, just to see it again. The space where his arrogance had been deconstructed and something better had begun. Emilio stayed, seated at the table for a moment after Arturo was gone. He didn't smile. He didn't feel vindicated. What he felt, more than anything, was something rarer. Hope, not in Arturo, but in what could happen next. Later that night, when the restaurant was empty again, Emilio found the folded note Arturo had left behind. Not the one Emilio had written, but one Arturo had written in return. On it were just 5 words, "I see it now too." In the days that followed Arturo's return, Monarca continued on as if nothing had changed. The staff moved through their shifts with the same precision and quiet pride. The kitchen buzzed, the tables filled. The soft music played beneath conversations that rose and fell like tides. But underneath the routine, something had shifted, not in the service, not in the food, in the air. More and more guests seemed to arrive with a different kind of energy. They weren't there just for the plates or the decor. They came carefully. They looked into the eyes of the servers when they ordered. They said please, they asked names. Something about the story, passed from person to person, reshared in posts and whispered between bites, had touched a nerve. The story wasn't about a billionaire or a scandal. It wasn't a twist designed for attention. It was about a man who listened, who didn't raise his voice, who chose silence when others chose power. That story stayed with people. One evening, a young couple sat by the window, sipping wine and whispering softly. As Emilio passed by, the woman looked up and said, "Are you the one from the story?" Emilio paused. He looked at her, then at her partner, who watched him with quiet curiosity. "I'm someone from it," Emilio said. Then he continued walking. He never confirmed or denied. He never sought credit. But he knew what had grown from that moment. Not fame. Not demand. Awareness. Across the dining room, he noticed something that made him stop mid-step. A boy, no more than 15, leaned down to help a server who had dropped a folded napkin on the floor. He didn't wait for applause. He simply did it, then went back to his meal. That was enough. A few weeks later, Monica was featured in a quiet editorial piece. Not a food review, but a reflection on hospitality and leadership. The writer, a frequent guest who had never revealed herself, described the restaurant as a place where service isn't submission and humility isn't weakness. She never mentioned Emilio by name. She didn't need to. But the effect was immediate. Reservations flooded. New faces arrived. Still, Monica never changed. Emilio made sure of it. They didn't expand hours, didn't raise prices, they stayed who they were. Because the moment you start shaping yourself to meet the world's expectations, you stop leading and start reacting. One morning, before the restaurant opened, Rosa approached Emilio as he walked through the dining room with his clipboard. "There's a reporter who wants to interview you," she said. "Big outlet. They want to do a profile." Emilio didn't even look up. "Tell them the restaurant speaks for itself. She said it would be good for business. We're already full." She smiled. "That's what I thought you'd say?" He nodded once, then adjusted a candle on table 7. Later that day he returned to his office, the same one with the narrow window, the worn desk, and the drawer full of small handwritten notes. He opened it and placed a new one inside. Not for anyone in particular, just for the next time it was needed. He kept every one that had been returned. Some were blank. Some had a single line scribbled in haste. Others were folded carefully like something sacred. Each one reminded him of something he'd always known but rarely said aloud. Most people don't want to be cruel. They just forget to be kind. That night, Monica welcomed a full house, every table occupied. Waiters moved like clockwork. Emilio stood by the bar for a moment, watching it all unfold. Then, something unexpected happened. Nico walked through the front door. He was alone. Taller than before, or maybe just carrying himself differently. No hoodie, no phone in his hand, just a boy growing into a man, walking into a place that had changed his father. He didn't ask to be seated. He waited by the door, unsure. Emilio approached, calm as ever. "Good evening," Emilio said. Nico hesitated. Then, after a beat, he nodded. "I don't need a table. I just came to say something." Emilio waited. Nico spoke quietly. "I was wrong that night. I watched everything, and I didn't understand any of it until later. You didn't embarrass us. You showed us who we were." Emilio looked at him. "And who are you now?" Nico shrugged, then looked away. "I don't know, still figuring that out, but I wanted to thank you for not saying what you could have said, for not making a scene." "That wouldn't have taught anything," Emilio replied. Nico looked up. "But this did." They stood in silence for a moment. No tension, no ceremony. Before turning to leave, Nico reached into his pocket and handed Emilio something small. It was a note. Folded. Familiar. "I copied yours," Nico said. "Thought maybe someday I'll need to use it." Emilio accepted it, placing it gently into his coat pocket. Nico left without another word. That evening, after the last guest had gone and the candles had been blown out, Emilio sat, once again, in his usual booth. The final plate had been washed, the floors cleaned. The city outside was quiet. He opened the note Nico had left him. Inside, written in steady, deliberate handwriting, were the words, "Respect isn't taught by being right. It's shown by being better." He read it once, then again. He folded it, placed it with the others in the drawer, and leaned back in his seat. The dining room was still. The chandeliers shimmered faintly above him, their reflections caught in the glass tabletops like constellations. He thought about every night that had led here, every dish washed, every insult endured, every silent moment that carried the weight of 10 loud ones, and he thought about the true cost of that evening with the Del Rincons, not in pesos or profits, but in the way something shifted in them, in him, in others who had nothing to do with it, but everything to learn from it. This was the real bill, not written in ink, but in memory, a bill paid by humility, served with grace, and collected quietly, table by table, in the hearts of those who finally stopped looking down long enough to see what had always been above them.